Welcome back to Reddit Audio Tales. Today's story is about Emma, a woman who made a shocking decision. She ghosted her fiancé the night before their wedding. 16 years later, she sends him a message like nothing happened. But what happened next? Stay tuned till the end. This one's a roller coaster of regret, growth, and hard truths. I'm Emma, I'm 38 now, and yeah, I finally reached out to him like nothing happened, because why shouldn't I? So here's the thing nobody talks about. Sometimes you just know something isn't right, but everyone around you is pushing you forward anyway. That's exactly what happened with Camden and me. We met in college when I was 21, studying something my parents basically forced me into because God forbid I make my own choices about anything. Camden was this sweet guy who actually listened when I complained about my family always controlling everything I did. He had this way of nodding and saying all the right things, but honestly, I think he just liked feeling needed. Don't get me wrong, Camden wasn't a bad guy. He was safe, predictable, the kind of man my parents would approve of, which should have been my first red flag right there. But I was young and tired of fighting about everything, so when he started hanging around more and more, I just let it happen. It was easier than dealing with drama, you know? He'd walk me to class, bring me coffee, all that typical college boyfriend stuff. My friends thought he was sweet, my parents loved him, and I just went along with it because, honestly, what else was I supposed to do? The thing is, I never felt that crazy in love feeling everyone talks about. You know, butterflies and all that nonsense. With Camden, it were like wearing a comfortable sweater. Nice enough, but nothing that made my heart race. He was always talking about our future together, planning things without really asking what I wanted. He'd say stuff like, when we get married, instead of if we get married, and I'd just smile and nod because confrontation has never been my thing. My best friend, Kelsey, was the only one who got it. She'd listen to me vent about how suffocated I felt, how Camden seemed to have our whole life mapped out without consulting me. She was the one person who didn't make me feel crazy for having doubts. Everyone else kept saying how lucky I was to have found someone so devoted, but Kelsey understood that devotion can feel like a prison when you never asked for it. The proposal was the worst part. Camden did it at a baseball game in front of thousands of people. The camera was on us, everyone was cheering, and I literally felt trapped. I wanted to say no so badly, but how do you crush someone's soul on the Jumbotron? So I said yes and smiled while dying inside. Later, when I tried to tell Camden I felt overwhelmed by the public proposal, he just laughed it off and said, I'd love telling the story to our kids someday. Our kids. Like that was already decided too. After that, the wedding planning became this nightmare I couldn't escape. My mom and his mom took over everything while I sat there like a decoration. They'd ask my opinion on flowers or cake flavors, but when I'd suggest something different, they'd exchange these looks like I was being difficult. Camden would always side with them, saying they just wanted everything to be perfect. Perfect for who, though? Because it sure wasn't feeling perfect for me. The worst part was how everyone kept talking about how happy I must be, how perfect we were together. People would coo over my ring and ask about dress shopping, and I'd have to fake this excited bride act when really, I just wanted to scream. Camden started planning our honeymoon without asking where I wanted to go, talking about kids like they were already on the way, and I felt like I was disappearing more every day. Kelsey was my lifeline during all this. She'd let me complain without judgment, and she was the only one who asked if I was actually happy or just going through the motions. When I'd break down crying about feeling trapped, she'd remind me that I didn't have to do anything I didn't want to do. She was right, but telling someone that and actually doing it are two completely different things. The night before the wedding, I was staying at my parents' house in my childhood bedroom, staring at my wedding dress hanging on the closet door. It looked like a costume for a play I never auditioned for. Camden had called earlier, all excited about seeing me tomorrow, talking about how perfect everything was going to be. But sitting there, I realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked what I wanted. Not my parents, not Camden, not the wedding planners, nobody. That's when Kelsey called. She could hear in my voice that I was falling apart, and she said something that changed everything. You know you don't have to go through with this, right? You can just leave. It sounds crazy, but until that moment, I honestly hadn't considered that walking away was an option. Everyone was so invested, so much money had been spent, so many people were coming. But Kelsey reminded me that it was my life, not theirs. You want to know something that's been eating at me for 16 years? I ghosted my fiancé the night before our wedding, and honestly, looking back, I'm not even sorry I did it. I'm Emma. I'm 38 now, and yeah, I finally reached out to him like nothing happened, because why shouldn't I? So I packed a bag while my parents slept downstairs, probably dreaming about their perfect daughter's perfect wedding. I didn't leave a note because what was I supposed to say? Sorry for not wanting the life you all planned for me. I grabbed my essentials, my car keys, and I left. Kelsey was waiting at the end of the street in her car, and we drove straight out of town. I turned off my phone and just kept driving. The freedom I felt in that moment was incredible. For the first time in months, maybe years, I could breathe. I wasn't disappointing anyone because I wasn't around to see their faces. I wasn't hurting Camden because I wasn't there to watch him process it. I was finally doing something for me, and it felt amazing. Kelsey kept telling me how brave I was, how I'd saved myself from a lifetime of regret. She got it in a way nobody else would have. We ended up in Dallas, crashing with some friends of hers while I figured out what came next. My phone stayed off for weeks because I knew the second I turned it on, the guilt trips would start. My parents would cry. Camden would want explanations. Everyone would try to drag me back into that suffocating life I'd just escaped. But for those first few weeks, I felt more like myself than I had in years. Eventually, I had to face reality. When I finally turned my phone back on, there were hundreds of messages. Some angry, some hurt, some just confused. My parents were furious, saying I'd humiliated the family and wasted everyone's money. Camden's messages went from desperate to heartbroken to finally just sad. But you know what? I still didn't regret it. I'd rather hurt people with the truth than live a lie for their comfort. The thing is, running away was supposed to be the hard part, but it turned out leaving was the easy part. Building an actual life for myself? That's where things got complicated. Living with Kelsey's friends was supposed to be temporary. But temporary turned into months, when I couldn't find steady work or afford my own place. I was starting completely over with nothing, which should have felt liberating. But mostly, it just felt scary. Kelsey was supportive at first, but I could tell her friends were getting tired of me crashing on their couch and not contributing much to household expenses. The freedom I'd felt driving away started feeling more like chaos. Without school, or Camden, or my parents' expectations structuring my days, I didn't really know who I was or what I wanted. I bounced between jobs, never staying anywhere long enough to build anything real. Sometimes it was because the work was boring, sometimes because managers were controlling, and sometimes because coworkers were just impossible to deal with. Looking back, maybe I was the problem. But at the time, it felt like everyone else was just too rigid or demanding. Kelsey and I started having more arguments about practical stuff, money, cleaning, plans for the future. She kept pushing me to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. But honestly, I was tired of people telling me what I should be doing. Wasn't the whole point of leaving to get away from that pressure? When her friends started making comments about me needing to get my act together, I knew it was time to move on again. That's when I made some questionable choices about who to trust and where to live. Without going into all the details, let's just say I ended up around people who weren't exactly building stable, legal lives. When you're desperate and don't have many options, you start justifying things you never thought you'd do. It wasn't like I woke up one day and decided to break the law. It was more like a series of small compromises that eventually led to bigger problems. The worst part wasn't even getting arrested. It was sitting in that cell realizing that all the freedom I'd been chasing had led me to the least free place possible. 3 years in prison gave me plenty of time to think about my choices. But honestly, I still didn't regret leaving Camden. Prison was terrible, but marrying someone I didn't love would have been worse. At least in prison, I knew why I was miserable. During those 3 years, I thought about Camden sometimes. I wondered if he'd gotten married, if he ever thought about me, if he understood why I left. But mostly I focused on getting through each day and planning what I'd do when I got out. I told myself that once I was free again, I'd build the life I actually wanted instead of the life everyone else expected me to have. Getting out was harder than going in. Having a record makes everything more complicated. Finding work, finding housing, building relationships. People look at you differently when they know you've been incarcerated, like you're fundamentally damaged or dangerous. I spent the first year after release just trying to survive, working whatever jobs would hire me, and living in whatever places would accept someone with my background. But slowly, things started improving. I found steady work, got my own small apartment, started rebuilding some kind of normal life. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I wasn't hurting anyone or living a lie, and that felt like progress. Still, there were lonely moments when I wondered about the road not taken. What would my life look like if I'd gone through with the wedding? Would Camden and I have been happy? Or would I have ended up divorced and bitter? That's when I started thinking about reaching out to him. After about a year of being out and getting my life somewhat stable, I got curious about Camden. Not in a romantic way exactly, but more like wondering how the story ended for him. Had he moved on? Was he angry? Did he ever understand why I left? Social media made it easy to find people, and one evening when I was feeling particularly lonely, I looked him up on Facebook. His profile was mostly private, but I could see enough to know he looked good. Older, obviously, but good. Successful. There were a few photos that suggested he was doing well for himself, living in a nice house, that kind of thing. Part of me was happy for him, but another part was almost annoyed that he seemed to have moved on so easily. Had losing me really not affected him that much? I spent weeks going back and forth about whether to reach out. What would I even say? Sorry for disappearing. Hope you're well. That seemed too casual. Sorry for ruining our wedding. Hope you can forgive me. That seemed too heavy. Finally, I decided to just keep it simple and see if he even wanted to talk. My message was basically, hey, I know it's been a long time, but I've been thinking about you and wondering how you're doing. Would you be open to meeting up sometime to talk? I think we both deserve some closure. I tried to sound casual, but sincere, like someone who'd grown up and wanted to make peace with the past. I honestly didn't expect him to respond. 16 years is a long time, and I figured he'd either ignore me or tell me to leave him alone. But he wrote back within a few days, saying he'd wondered about me too, and that meeting up might be good for both of us. He suggested a cafe in Phoenix that was neutral territory for both of us. Reading his response, I felt this weird mix of excitement and nervousness. Part of me was curious to see who he'd become, but another part was worried about what he'd think of who I'd become. The last time he saw me, I was a 22-year-old college graduate with my whole life ahead of me. Now I was a 38-year-old ex-con trying to rebuild from scratch. I spent way too much time planning what to wear and what to say. I wanted to look like I was doing well, without seeming like I was trying too hard. I practiced different versions of my story. How much to share about where I'd been, how to explain the choices I'd made, how to frame everything in a way that didn't make me sound completely irresponsible. The week before we were supposed to meet, I kept changing my mind about whether this was a good idea. What if seeing him brought back feelings I'd buried? What if he was angry and just wanted to yell at me? What if he'd become someone completely different? But ultimately, my curiosity won out. I needed to know how this chapter of my life would end. The morning of our meeting, I woke up early and spent way too long getting ready. I chose an outfit that was casual but put together, did my makeup carefully to cover some of the harder years, and tried to psych myself up for whatever was about to happen. This was just coffee between two adults who used to know each other. No big deal. Except it felt like a very big deal. Walking into that cafe, I spotted Camden immediately, even though he looked older. He'd aged well, better than me, if I'm being honest. The years had been kinder to him than they'd been to me, and I felt a flash of something that might have been jealousy. He was sitting at a corner table, looking nervous but composed, like someone who'd had time to prepare for this conversation. When our eyes met, there was this moment of recognition mixed with shock. I could see him taking in how I looked now, the wear and tear that comes from hard living, the scars on my arms that I couldn't completely hide, the way life had marked me in ways it clearly hadn't marked him. But he smiled and stood up to greet me, and for a second it felt almost normal. We started with small talk. How was the drive? Nice place? You look good. The kind of meaningless pleasantries that buy time while you figure out what you really want to say. But I could tell he was studying me, trying to reconcile the person sitting across from him with the woman who disappeared from his life all those years ago. Finally, he asked the question I'd been dreading and expecting. Why did you leave? I'd rehearsed this answer, but sitting there looking at him, all my prepared explanations felt inadequate. How do you tell someone that you left because you felt trapped by their love? How do you explain that their vision of happiness felt like a prison? How do you say that you weren't brave enough to communicate your feelings like an adult? So I told him the truth, or at least my version of it. I explained about feeling pressured by everyone around us, about not knowing how to speak up for what I wanted, about feeling like I was disappearing into the life everyone else had planned for me. I talked about the panic I felt as the wedding approached, the sense that I was about to make a terrible mistake that would affect the rest of my life. Camden listened without interrupting, his expressions shifting between hurt and understanding and something that might have been relief. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before saying, "I wish you'd talk to me." I would have listened. That hit harder than I expected because I knew he was right. Camden had always been a good listener, had always tried to make me happy. The problem wasn't that he wouldn't have understood. The problem was that I was too much of a coward to have the conversation. I was so used to avoiding conflict that I chose the most dramatic form of conflict avoidance possible. But admitting that felt like taking responsibility for hurting him, and I wasn't ready to do that. Instead, I focused on how young we were, how much pressure we were under, how maybe it was better that I figured out we weren't right for each other before we got married instead of after. Then Camden dropped his own bombshell. He told me he'd been married for 10 years to someone named Rachel, and they had 2 kids together. He showed me pictures on his phone, a pretty woman with kind eyes, 2 adorable kids who looked like miniature versions of him. They looked genuinely happy, in a way that made my chest tight with something I didn't want to name. "She's wonderful," he said, talking about Rachel with the kind of warmth in his voice that I remembered him using when he talked about our future together. "She actually communicates when something's bothering her instead of just disappearing." That stung, even though I knew I deserved it. But then he said something that made everything worse. "I'm grateful you left." He explained that my disappearing act had forced him to really examine what he wanted from a relationship and what kind of partner he wanted to be. He'd gone to therapy, worked on himself, learned to communicate better, meaning Rachel had shown him what it felt like to be with someone who actually wanted to be there, who chose him every day instead of just going along with things. "What we had wasn't real love," he said gently. "It was just comfortable for both of us until it wasn't comfortable for you." Sitting there, listening to him talk about his happy marriage and personal growth, I felt something ugly rising in my chest. Here I was, 38 and alone, still struggling to build a stable life, while he'd turned my worst moment into his best opportunity for growth. It felt unfair in a way I couldn't articulate. I tried to share some of my story, the years of instability, the mistakes I'd made, the time in prison, but I could see in his eyes that he'd moved so far past our shared history that my struggles felt irrelevant to him. He was polite and even sympathetic, but there was no connection there anymore. I was just someone from his past who'd caused him pain that he'd successfully healed from. When we said goodbye in the parking lot, Camden gave me a brief hug and said he was glad we'd had the chance to talk. He hoped I'd find happiness and stability, and he meant it in the nicest possible way. But I could tell that for him, this conversation was about closing a chapter that he'd already moved past. For me, it felt like confirmation that I'd wasted 16 years wondering about something that had never been as important as I'd thought it was. Driving home, I felt this weird mix of closure and emptiness. I'd gotten the answers I'd been looking for, but they weren't the answers I'd hoped for. Camden hadn't been pining for me all these years. He hadn't wondered what if. He'd moved on completely and built something better than what we'd had. The more I thought about our conversation over the following weeks, the more frustrated I became. Everyone had moved on but me. Camden had his perfect little family. My parents had probably forgotten they ever had a daughter who disappointed them. And I was still here, dealing with the consequences of choices I'd made when I was barely an adult. And that's when I realized something that maybe I should have figured out years ago. I wasn't actually sorry for leaving Camden. I was sorry that leaving him hadn't led to the amazing life I'd imagined for myself. I was sorry that my grand gesture of independence had resulted in prison and struggle and loneliness. But I wasn't sorry for refusing to live a life that felt wrong for me. The problem was that I'd spent 16 years thinking about the road not taken, instead of focusing on building the road I was actually on. I'd wasted so much time wondering what if that I'd never fully committed to figuring out what I actually wanted from life. And now, at 38, I was starting over again while everyone else my age had careers and families and stability. But you know what? I'm still not sorry I left. Yeah, my life didn't turn out the way I planned, but at least it's my life. I made my choices, even the bad ones, and I lived with the consequences. Camden got his happy ending with someone who was actually right for him, and maybe that's better for everyone. I just wish someone had told me that running away from the wrong life doesn't automatically lead you to the right one. That takes work I wasn't ready to do at 22, and honestly, I'm not sure I'm ready to do now at 38. But at least now I know that the person I was then wasn't capable of being the wife Camden deserved. And he found someone who was. I still think about that meeting sometimes, about how different our lives turned out. But mostly I try to focus on moving forward instead of looking back. I've spent enough time regretting choices I can't change. The only thing I can control now is what comes next, and I'm determined to make that count for something. Even if I have no idea what that something is yet. At least I'm finally living my own life instead of the life everyone else wanted for me. Even if it's messier and lonelier than I expected, it's mine, and maybe that's enough.